Welcome to our deep dive. We're going to be exploring the world of boundaries today.
Boundaries, yeah. So we'll be unpacking some powerful insights from this book. It's called Boundaries. When to say yes, how to say no to take control of your life.
It's by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend, in case you want to follow along.
And it's full of relatable examples, stories, even a parable about a lawn.
A lawn. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
But before we get into all that, let's start with the basics.
Sure.
How would you define boundaries? I feel like it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but maybe we don't always stop to think about what it really means.
Yeah, it's easy to take it for granted. Well, I think at their core, boundaries are like property lines for our lives. They define what is okay and what's not okay.
Like what we're willing to accept from others.
Exactly, and what we're not.
Okay, so it's about protecting our physical space, our emotional space, even our mental space.
Yeah, all of that. And it's about recognizing that we're responsible for ourselves.
Even though we're also responsible to others.
That's the tricky part, right?
Yeah.
Finding that balance.
Definitely. It makes me think about all those times I've said yes to things I didn't really want to do, ending up feeling resentful and drained.
Yes. The classic people-pleasing trap.
Is that what the book means by the power of no? Being able to set those limits?
Absolutely. If you can't say no, you can't truly say yes either. It's about making those choices from a place of authenticity, not obligation.
It's like when you're always saying yes out of guilt or fear, your yes loses its meaning.
Exactly. It becomes more of a knee-jerk reaction than a true commitment.
Have you ever felt that? Like your yes was more automatic than genuine?
Oh, all the time. Especially in the past, before I really understood the importance of boundaries.
I know what you mean. So how do we even learn to set those boundaries in the first place? I know the book talks about how it starts in childhood. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. They break it down into 3 key phases. The first is hatching. It's when babies start realizing they're separate from their mothers, developing that initial sense of me.
So it's that very first awareness of being an individual.
Yes. Then comes the practicing phase. Think of a toddler who's just learned to walk. They're all over the place, testing limits.
Oh, I know that phase all too well.
Yeah.
They want to touch everything, climb everything.
Exactly. And that's where parents come in. They need to provide a safe space for exploration while also setting those limits.
It's like letting them explore their independence, but with those safety nets in place.
Exactly. How parents respond to a child's no during this phase is so crucial.
So if a child is constantly shut down or punished for asserting themselves,
It can really impact their ability to set boundaries later in life. They might associate it with negative consequences.
that makes sense. What's the last phase?
Rapprochement. Kind of a reality check for the toddler. They realize they can't do everything they want. It's coming back down to earth after that burst of freedom.
And realizing they still need their parents' guidance.
Exactly. Now, the book doesn't just talk theory. They use real-life examples to show how this plays out.
That's always helpful. Do any specific examples come to mind?
They tell the story of Jerry, whose childhood experiences really shaped his ability to set boundaries as an adult.
Oh, yes, Jerry. His story is heartbreaking. His mother's love was conditional on his obedience. Imagine that. Enduring abuse just to feel loved.
His yes became a survival mechanism. And sadly, that pattern carried into his adult relationships.
It made him vulnerable to manipulation. It really highlights how crucial healthy boundaries are.
They're not about being selfish or mean. They're about protecting ourselves so we can show up in relationships from a healthier place.
That's such an important point. Now, the book lays out 10 laws of boundaries. I know we can't cover all of them, but are there a few that stand out as particularly relatable?
Definitely. The law of sowing and reaping is a big one. Actions have consequences.
Right, that makes sense. It reminds me of something else the book talks about, the difference between being responsible for ourselves and to others.
Yes, they illustrate this with the idea that you can love someone without fixing their problems.
Which can be so hard to do, especially with those we care about.
It's a tough one. But it's about recognizing those limits. You can be there for them, offer support, but you can't take on their burdens as your own.
Sometimes trying to help can actually enable someone's unhealthy behavior.
Right. And that's where that law of responsibility comes in. Another crucial one is the law of power.
Okay, power. That sounds intriguing. What's that all about?
Basically, it says you can't change other people, but you can change how you interact with them.
I like that. It shifts the focus from trying to control others to taking control of our own responses.
Exactly. And it can be incredibly empowering.
Do they give any examples of this in action, like someone successfully applying this law?
They tell the story of a wife who was constantly trying to change her controlling husband.
Ooh, I can relate to that struggle.
Her attempts were actually fueling the cycle until she started setting clear boundaries, stating her needs, and refusing to engage in his manipulative tactics.
Wow, so her boundaries created a shift in the dynamic.
It was tough, but it led to a much healthier relationship.
So it's not about giving up on the person, but about changing our approach.
Exactly. Now, I know there are a lot of misconceptions about boundaries, what the book calls myths. Can we debunk a few of those?
Absolutely. I'm sure our listeners have encountered these.
One huge myth is that boundaries are selfish.
Yeah, I've heard that one a lot.
But the book reframes it beautifully. They say stewardship of yourself is loving.
I love that. It's not selfish to take care of yourself. It's actually essential to loving and serving others well.
Another myth. Boundaries mean you're angry, not true. Boundaries often reduce anger by creating safety and control.
So it's not about shutting people out in anger, but about creating a space where we don't get to that point.
Exactly. It's about proactive communication, not an outburst of rage. Another one, fear that boundaries will hurt others.
Oh yeah, the guilt trip.
People worry about damaging relationships or causing pain, but the book distinguishes between honesty and harm.
So being truthful might cause discomfort, but it's not the same as intentionally hurting someone.
Right, it's about speaking our truth with love and respect, even when it's hard.
Do they give any examples of how this plays out in real life? Like someone who was afraid to set a boundary, but then found it wasn't as bad as they feared.
They tell the story of Brenda. She was afraid to tell her boss she wouldn't work weekends without pay.
It can be so scary to set those boundaries at work.
But it turns out her boss was totally understanding.
Wow, so her fear was worse than the reality.
Often our fears are bigger than the actual situation. People respond better to honesty and clear expectations than we think.
That's encouraging. So we've talked about the general idea of boundaries, but how does this apply to specific relationships? I know the book delves into different areas like marriage, parenting, work, friendships.
They cover a lot of ground. One interesting story is about Dan, who felt like second fiddle to his wife's father.
Ooh, that's tricky. Family dynamics can be so complex.
It highlights the importance of boundaries with families of origin. It's about finding that healthy separation, that balance between honoring your family and building your own independent life.
It's like untangling a knot, those family ties.
Exactly. Creating space for those new bonds.
Did they give any advice for navigating those family situations?
They emphasize the biblical principle of leaving before cleaving. It's about separating from our families of origin to build our own lives and relationships.
That makes sense. It's about creating those healthy boundaries so you can fully commit to your chosen family.
And they also warn against triangulation,
What's that?
talking about someone to a third party instead of addressing the issue directly. Have you ever been in a situation where that's happening?
Ugh. Yes, all the time. It creates so much drama and misunderstanding.
It's classic unhealthy boundaries. They quote Proverbs. He who rebukes a man will in the end gain more favor than he who has a flattering tongue.
So it's better to have those tough conversations directly, even if it's uncomfortable.
Honesty, even when it's tough, is essential for strong relationships. What about boundaries at work? I know a lot of people struggle with that.
I know I do. It's hard to say no to your boss or set limits when you're worried about your job.
They highlight Lori, who was constantly overworked and felt like she couldn't say no. Her story shows how setting boundaries can actually empower you professionally.
Okay, I'm all ears. How did she do it?
Lori started by saying no to tasks outside her job description and setting clear expectations about her availability.
That's brave.
And what's fascinating is that it actually exposed deeper company issues. Her boss was relying on her to cover for his disorganization.
Wow, so her boundaries acted like a mirror, reflecting back a problem that needed to be addressed.
Exactly. And as a result, her boss had to step up and the company became more efficient.
It shows how one person's boundaries can have a ripple effect, leading to positive change that benefits everyone.
That's really encouraging. But it's not just about external relationships, right? The book also talks about setting boundaries with ourselves.
Oh yeah, those internal boundaries are crucial.
Oh,
I think that's where a lot of us struggle.
It's just as vital. They cover 7 key areas: eating, money, time, task completion, speech, sexuality, and alcohol and substance use.
It's like having internal nets to catch us when we're about to make a bad decision.
It's about recognizing our limitations and developing self-control. They tell the story of Jessica, who realized her eating disorder stemmed from a lack of self-boundaries.
That makes so much sense. It's about creating those healthy limits to protect ourselves.
And with support, open communication, and healthy coping mechanisms, she started to heal. It reminds us we don't have to fight those battles alone. Support and accountability are key.
Absolutely. And what about those times when we know we need to set boundaries, but we just feel so resistant? What advice do they offer for overcoming that resistance?
Well, first, acknowledge the resistance. It's natural, especially if you've always prioritized others.
That's me, always putting everyone else's needs before my own.
It's a common pattern.
Yeah.
They also say, seek support, grieve any losses that come with setting boundaries, embrace failure as part of growth,
Failure as growth. I like that. It takes the pressure off.
and practice saying no to small things first.
Like baby steps towards those bigger boundaries.
Exactly. It's a process, not an overnight transformation.
So what's the payoff? What positive changes can we expect when we start setting healthy boundaries?
Healthier relationships, greater self-respect, a more fulfilling life.
It sounds pretty good to me. Did they give any examples of people who experienced those benefits?
They share a heartwarming story about a couple, Sherry and Walt, whose marriage drastically improved after Sherry started setting boundaries.
Oh, I'm definitely curious to hear more about their story. What was their marriage like before she started setting those boundaries?
Well, Sherry was doing everything for everyone, husband, kids, friends, church, totally overwhelmed and resentful.
I can relate to that feeling, like you're constantly giving but not receiving.
It's the classic boundaryless life leading to burnout. She was on the phone with a friend, venting about her day when her husband walked in and just started talking about his own stuff.
So he completely interrupted her, not even acknowledging that she was in the middle of a conversation.
Yeah, and this wasn't a one-time thing, it was a pattern. Sherry felt completely disregarded.
Like her needs didn't matter.
Exactly. But then she remembered what she was learning about boundaries. And instead of just going along with it like she usually did, she decided to speak up.
I bet that was tough. After years of just accepting this behavior.
It wasn't easy. But she took a deep breath and said, "Honey, I'm on the phone right now. Can you please wait until I'm finished?"
And how did he react?
He was surprised at first. He wasn't used to her setting limits. But she stayed calm and firm, explaining that she needed him to respect her time and her conversations.
It's those small moments of courage that can make a big difference.
It's true. And it was a turning point for them. That one boundary led to a cascade of positive changes in their marriage.
So her boundary actually brought them closer together.
It did. It created more mutual respect and understanding. Sherry felt heard and valued, and Walt started taking more responsibility for his own needs and emotions.
It's a great example of how counterintuitive boundaries can be. We think they create distance, but they can actually lead to deeper connection.
That's such a powerful takeaway. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to invite you to reflect on what we've discussed so far.
I think it's sinking in that boundaries aren't about being rigid or controlling. They're about honoring ourselves and creating healthier relationships.
Exactly. It's about creating a space where everyone can thrive.
And it's a journey, not a destination. We're all learning and growing along the way.
Absolutely. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore even more practical steps for putting these principles into action.
I'm excited to continue this exploration. But for now, let these insights from part 1 sink in. Maybe journal about it, or chat with a friend about what resonated with you.
And stay tuned for part 2, where we'll get even more specific and practical about how to apply these principles in your own life.
Until then,
See you then.
welcome back to our deep dive into boundaries. In part 1, we really dug into the foundation of boundaries, what they are, why they matter, even how they develop from childhood.
And those real-life examples really bring it all to life, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Like Sherry, who was feeling so overwhelmed in her marriage before she started setting boundaries. I'm really curious to hear more about how that played out for her. Remember, she was on the phone with a friend when her husband barged in.
Oh, yeah. Sherry's day was just packed with those boundary issues.
The book goes into detail about it, right?
Yeah. So after that phone call during dinner, her teenage son, Brian, comes in demanding she drive him to soccer practice, even though it wasn't her day.
Ugh, teenagers. They're boundary-pushing experts.
Well, it's like they have a sixth sense for those weak spots.
Did she give in?
She almost did, out of habit, that automatic mom mode.
I know it well.
But then she remembered what she was learning about boundaries. She was enabling Brian's sense of entitlement by always rescuing him.
It's those moments of awareness that are so key.
Yeah, that pause where we can choose a different response.
Instead of just reacting on autopilot.
Exactly. So Sherry takes a deep breath and tells Brian, "No, I'm not available. It's Dad's turn. You need to work this out with him."
And how did he take it?
Oh, he threw a tantrum, of course. But Sherry stood her ground. She reminded him that she loved him, but she wouldn't be manipulated.
That takes guts. I can imagine it wasn't easy.
It wasn't. But she held firm, and Brian eventually calmed down and accepted her decision.
So her boundary actually taught him responsibility.
Exactly. It's a win-win. It's about finding that balance between love and limits.
It's not about punishing him, but about creating a healthy dynamic.
Right. It's giving him the opportunity to step up and learn to solve his own problems.
Laura reminds me of Lori, who learned to say no to her boss, even though she was worried about the consequences.
Oh, yeah. Lori's story is a great example of setting boundaries at work.
What happened after she started setting those limits? Did her boss get angry?
Well, Jeff, her boss, wasn't thrilled. He was used to her being available 24/7.
Yeah, that always-on culture is so prevalent these days.
He even tried to guilt trip her into taking on more.
It's interesting how some people resist boundaries, even when they actually benefit everyone in the long run.
It's true. It can be a real challenge to shift those dynamics. But Lori stood her ground. She reminded Jeff that she was committed to her job, but she also had a life outside work.
Setting those healthy boundaries.
And it was amazing what happened next. Lori's boundaries actually revealed a deeper issue. Jeff was relying on her to cover for his own disorganization.
So she was enabling his dysfunction.
Exactly. But by setting those limits, Lori forced Jeff to step up and become more accountable.
Wow, so her boundaries had this ripple effect, improving the whole work dynamic.
The company became more efficient because of it.
It's such a great example of how sometimes saying no can lead to a better outcome for everyone.
Sometimes those boundaries are the catalyst for positive change we didn't even see coming.
Now, we've talked about those external boundaries, but what about those internal ones? The boundaries we set with ourselves.
Oh, those are just as important. Remember Keith? He struggled with overspending, always in debt because of impulsive purchases.
Oh yeah, I remember Keith. His story felt so relatable.
He was a kind and generous guy, but just couldn't control his spending.
I think a lot of us struggle with those internal boundaries, whether it's overspending, procrastination, or other self-sabotaging behaviors.
It's those impulses that can really derail us.
The book emphasizes that these self-boundaries are just as crucial as the external ones, right?
Absolutely. They're about knowing our limits, recognizing those triggers, and developing healthy coping mechanisms.
So how did Keith start to tackle his overspending?
He got support, a financial advisor and a support group. It's proof that we don't have to do this alone.
Having that accountability can make all the difference.
It's huge, and he started tracking his spending, creating a budget, setting realistic goals, those practical tools.
It's about putting those systems in place to support those internal boundaries.
Exactly, and it worked. Keith started to gain control of his finances. He was finally able to save money and even start investing.
So he not only got out of debt, but he also started building a more secure future.
It's a great example of how setting those internal boundaries can create a ripple effect of positive change in all areas of our lives.
Speaking of ripple effects, the book also had that fascinating example of Bill, who talked excessively.
Oh yeah, Bill. He just couldn't stop talking. He struggled to listen, interrupted constantly, went off on tangents. Lacking that internal filter.
It sounds exhausting.
It was, and it
Yeah.
really strained his relationships. People felt like he wasn't really listening to them.
Like he was more interested in hearing himself talk than in having real conversation.
Exactly. His communication style reflected that lack of internal boundaries. The book highlights the need for self-awareness and self-control in our communication if we want to connect with others on a deeper level.
So how did Bill start to create those internal boundaries?
He did something really brave. He asked for honest feedback from people he trusted. It's not always easy to hear those truths about ourselves.
That takes humility.
It does. But he was committed to growth, and he started actively practicing listening skills, trying to be more present and attentive when others were speaking.
So it was about shifting from a self-focused way of communicating to one that was more focused on the other person.
That's a great way to put it. And it took time and effort, but it was worth it. Bill's relationships improved dramatically as he learned to listen and communicate more effectively.
It's proof that those internal boundaries can have a profound impact on our relationships.
It's amazing, right? Now, something that really caught my attention in the book was their discussion of boundaries in our relationship with God. It's not something we often think about, but it makes so much sense.
I know. It adds a whole new dimension to this conversation.
They point out that if we view God as controlling or punitive, we might struggle to set boundaries in our own lives. It's like we're afraid to say no or assert our needs out of fear of punishment.
So our image of God can actually impact our ability to set those healthy boundaries.
Absolutely. And that's why they emphasize the importance of having a healthy view of God. one that sees him as loving, just, and respecting our boundaries.
It's a more balanced perspective, recognizing both his sovereignty and our free will.
They even use that parable of the wedding banquet from Matthew's Gospel to illustrate this point.
That's the one where the king invites all these guests to a feast, but they make excuses and don't show up. What's the connection to boundaries?
Well, they point out that even though the king is disappointed, he respects their decision. He doesn't force them to come or punish them for declining his invitation.
It's a beautiful image of God's respect for our free will, even when we choose differently than he desires.
Exactly. It shows us that we can say no, even to God, without fear of retribution.
That's a comforting thought. But it also reminds us that God is not a genie in a bottle, obligated to grant our every wish.
Right. It's about having realistic expectations about prayer, recognizing that sometimes God's answer might be no, or not yet, or I have something even better in store for you.
So it's about surrendering control and trusting in his plan, even when we don't understand it.
Exactly. And it's about respecting his boundaries, too, recognizing that he's not obligated to rescue us from every consequence or fix every problem.
Those struggles and consequences are often part of our growth process, aren't they?
They are. It's about trusting that God's no can sometimes be a gift, even if we don't see it that way at the time.
I love that perspective. Now, as we delve deeper into this topic of boundaries, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not always easy. There are often fears and resistances that come up.
Oh, absolutely. It can feel really scary to start setting those limits, especially if we're not used to it.
What are some of the common fears that people face?
Fear of rejection, fear of disappointing others, guilt, anxiety, those are all so common.
I know I've experienced all of those at different points in my life.
It's human nature, but the book encourages us to remember that these fears don't have to control us.
So how do we face those fears?
By acknowledging them, first of all. Don't try to pretend they're not there, but then remind yourself that your needs are valid, even if other people don't like it.
And it's helpful to find support, right?
Mm-hmm.
People who will encourage us on this journey.
Absolutely. That's crucial. Surround yourself with those who understand and support your growth.
It's like having our own boundary support team.
I love that. They even share a story about a woman named Jan who is struggling to set boundaries with her husband, Ben.
Oh, yes. Tell me more about their story.
Well, Ben was a loving husband, but he was also really irresponsible. He'd break promises, neglect chores. He just lacked those boundaries of personal accountability.
And how is this affecting Jan?
She was carrying the weight of his lack of boundaries, feeling overwhelmed, resentful, taken advantage of.
It's so common in relationships where one person has weak boundaries. The other person ends up carrying the burden.
Exactly. And talking to Ben about it hadn't worked. He'd apologize, promise to do better, but then fall back into those old patterns.
It can be so frustrating when that happens, like your words aren't being heard.
It is. So Jan realized she had to do something different. She had to change her responses.
Instead of trying to change him.
Right. So she started setting clear consequences for Ben's behavior. She refused to cover for him or bail him out financially.
Wow, that's tough love.
It was. But it was also an act of love, because those consequences actually helped Ben to see the impact of his actions.
And did it work?
It did. Ben started taking more responsibility for his choices. He got a handle on his finances, started following through on his commitments.
So her boundaries actually motivated him to step up.
They did. And as a result, their marriage was transformed. Jan felt respected and valued, and Ben, despite being held accountable, actually felt more loved and supported.
That's amazing. It shows how boundaries, even though they might seem like they're pushing people away, can actually create a stronger foundation for connection.
It's counterintuitive, but it's true. Those limits create space for real growth and intimacy.
The book also highlighted the importance of not just focusing on the struggles, but also celebrating the victories along the way, right?
Oh, absolutely. They share the inspiring story of Randy, who discovered a hidden passion after setting boundaries at work.
I'm always drawn to those stories of unexpected transformation. Tell me more about Randy.
Well, Randy was a classic people pleaser, always saying yes, working late, taking on extra projects, completely burning himself out.
It's so easy to fall into that trap, especially in today's demanding work culture.
It is. But Randy started to notice that he was feeling resentful. He was losing his spark, his joy.
Just like that inner voice starts whispering, something's not right here.
Exactly. So he knew he had to make a change. He started saying no more often, delegating tasks, prioritizing his own well-being.
That must have been tough after years of being the yes man.
It was. There was definitely some pushback from his colleagues and even his boss. But Randy communicated clearly and respectfully, explaining his need for balance.
And did creating that space allow him to find his passion?
It did. Randy had always loved painting, but he'd never had the time to pursue it. But with his newfound freedom, he started painting again. And it was something awakened within him.
Like he'd rediscovered a lost part of himself.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a hobby. He was incredibly talented. He even started exhibiting and selling his work.
Wow, so his boundaries not only created more time and energy, but they also opened up this whole new creative avenue for him.
It's a beautiful example of how closing one door can open another to something even more fulfilling. It's not just about saying no, it's about saying yes to ourselves and our own needs and desires.
And sometimes those needs and desires lead us to unexpected places.
That's the beauty of it. It's a reminder to trust the journey and to be open to those new possibilities that unfold when we create healthy boundaries in our lives.
Now, the book also addresses the more challenging aspects of setting boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Like those situations where we might feel guilty or afraid to say no.
Right. They acknowledge that those feelings are normal, especially if we've been conditioned to prioritize others' needs above our own.
What about those situations where someone is in genuine need? It can be so hard to set boundaries when we want to help.
They give the example of a woman who was constantly bombarded by requests for favors and money. She had a big heart and wanted to be compassionate, but it was leading to resentment and burnout.
It's like that compassion fatigue that can set in when we're constantly giving without taking care of ourselves.
Exactly. And the book reminds us that it's okay to say no, even to those in need, if it's necessary to protect our own well-being. You can't pour from an empty cup.
So it's about finding that balance, that sweet spot where we can be helpful to others without sacrificing our own needs.
Right. They also talk about how unresolved childhood issues can fuel our resistance to setting boundaries.
That's like those old patterns and wounds can keep us stuck in those unhealthy dynamics.
Exactly. So it's important to address those deeper issues, to heal and move forward with confidence and self-awareness.
And that's where therapy or support groups can be so helpful.
Absolutely. They provide a safe space to explore those wounds and develop healthier coping mechanisms.
And to find those supportive relationships that offer unconditional love and acceptance.
That's key. The book emphasizes that setting boundaries is not a solo mission.
It's easier when we have the right people cheering us on.
Exactly. They even talk about the importance of grieving any losses that come with setting boundaries.
Losses. What do they mean by that?
Well, sometimes when we start setting boundaries, we might lose certain relationships or dynamics that weren't actually healthy for us, even if they felt comfortable or familiar.
So it's a process of letting go of what no longer serves us.
It is. And it can be painful, but it's also a necessary part of growth. It's like clearing out the weeds to make space for those beautiful flowers to bloom.
It's creating a more vibrant and authentic life.
Exactly. Now, in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some practical steps for overcoming those fears and resistances and actually putting these principles into action. Are you ready for that?
I am. I'm feeling so inspired to take this to the next level.
Me too. We'll cover everything from having those tough conversations to dealing with guilt trips and manipulative tactics.
I think those are the areas where a lot of people get stuck.
They are. But we'll break it down into manageable steps and provide you with the tools and strategies you need to navigate those challenges with confidence and grace.
This is going to be so empowering. I can't wait to share these insights with our listeners. But for now, let's pause here and take a moment to absorb everything we've discussed so far. If you're feeling inspired, jot down any thoughts or reflections that come up.
Maybe there's a specific relationship that comes to mind, or perhaps a boundary you've been wanting to set but haven't had the courage to do so. Hold on to those thoughts. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore how to turn those insights into action so you can start experiencing the transformative power of boundaries in your own life.
I'm so excited to continue this journey with you. Stay tuned for part 3. Welcome back to our deep dive into boundaries. It feels like we've covered so much ground already.
We have, from those basic definitions all the way to how this impacts our relationship with God.
And those personal stories, they make it all so real, don't they?
They do.
Yeah.
It's like we get to peek into other people's lives and see how these principles play out.
You left us at the end of part 2 with a really thought-provoking question. You asked us to think about which key takeaway resonated most with us from everything we discussed so far.
Oh, yeah. I'm curious. What stood out for you?
For me, it was that image of boundaries as fences in a garden.
Ah, beautiful. Protecting those precious seeds.
It just captured that sense of boundaries being not about shutting ourselves off from the world, but about creating a safe space to grow and thrive.
It's like creating that fertile ground where we can flourish.
Exactly. And I think that ties into that idea of boundaries being essential for an authentic and fulfilling life.
It's true. When we have those healthy limits in place, we're free to be ourselves, to pursue our passions, to connect with others in a more genuine way.
Speaking of connecting with others, I'm still thinking about that point you made about boundaries contributing to a more just and compassionate world.
It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does. But you shared that example in part two about that business negotiation.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
The one with the CEO who was trying to bully everyone into accepting a bad deal.
And one of the partners had the courage to stand up to him.
He was the only one who'd grown up with healthy boundaries, so he wasn't intimidated.
It's amazing how our childhood experiences can shape how we respond to those high-pressure situations.
It's true. And because he had that strong sense of self-worth, he was able to set clear limits and refuse to be manipulated. He knew that giving in would actually compromise the integrity of the deal.
So his boundaries were about more than just protecting himself. They were about upholding a higher ethical standard.
Exactly. And ultimately, his courage to stand firm led to a fairer outcome for everyone involved.
It's inspiring. One person's commitment to boundaries creating a ripple effect of positive change, even in a cutthroat business environment.
It's a powerful reminder that our choices matter.
And it's not just about those big heroic moments.
Right. The book also highlights those everyday moments where we choose to honor our needs and speak our truth.
Like saying no to that extra commitment, or setting a limit with a friend who's overstepping.
Each one of those seemingly small acts contributes to a culture of respect and accountability.
And ultimately, to a more just and compassionate world.
It's about shifting those norms, one interaction at a time.
So we really do have the power to make a difference.
We do. And that's why it's so important to approach this journey of boundary setting with compassion, both for ourselves and others.
Because it's not about being perfect. We're all going to make mistakes along the way.
It's about progress, not perfection.
And about remembering that just like a gardener tends to their plants, we need to tend to our boundaries with care and attention.
Some might need strengthening, some might need loosening.
It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot where we feel both protected and free.
They also talk about surrounding ourselves with people who support our boundaries.
Because, let's be honest, not everyone is going to be happy when we start setting limits.
That's true. Some people might push back, try to guilt trip us back into old patterns.
That's when it's so crucial to have those supportive friends, family members, therapists, whoever it might be.
Those people who believe in us and remind us of our worth.
It's like having our own cheering squad for boundaries.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage you to really embrace this journey.
It might feel challenging at times, even scary, but it's a path that leads to so much freedom, authenticity, and joy.
And you don't have to do it alone. Find your support system. Practice those small acts of boundary setting and celebrate every victory.
The world needs your unique voice and your healthy boundaries.
It does. This has been such a rich conversation. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share these insights with you.
Thank you for being our guide. I know our listeners have learned so much from your wisdom and expertise.
If you're feeling inspired to go deeper, definitely pick up a copy of Boundaries by Dr. Cloud and Dr. Townsend.
It's full of practical advice and inspiring stories that can help you navigate those complexities.
It's a game changer.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of boundaries. Until next time, keep exploring, keep growing, and keep setting those healthy limits.
See you next time.